Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Potawatomi Casino Hotel Milwaukee, home to 24/7 excitement, dining, and an on-site hotel at 1721 West Canal Street. More information at potawatomi.com.
You don't need to travel far to see stunning birds. In fact, they're often right in our backyards. But if you want to welcome more feathered friends to your yard, it's important to think beyond bird feeders. Mariette Nowak is an ecologist and the author of Birdscaping for Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region. Birdscaping is just landscaping with birds in mind, and Nowak says growing native plants can create a year-round bird sanctuary. She joins Lake Effect's Excret Nunez to share how people can create a pocket of paradise for birds this spring.
For this episode of Chirp Chat, I wanted to learn how people can get their gardens ready to welcome birds this spring and summer. And a lot of people think that putting up bird feeders is a way to attract birds to their gardens, but you explain in your book that native plants are the best way to attract them. So why are native plants good for birds?
Well, native plants will provide a much more variety of foods than we can do at our feeders. And native plants have evolved with birds through centuries and centuries, and they produce just the right kind of food at the right time of year for birds and the right nutrition. So evolving through the years, Mother Nature has perfected things.
So would you say that birds would rather come to plants than a bird feeder?
Well, they like both. I have feeders too. I love to have feeders, especially in the winter when there's not as many plants and fruits and seeds available in your garden. So I like that too. And sometimes birds find it easier to get some seeds, but there's birds that don't eat seeds. Only really a relatively small fraction of birds come to feeders. And a lot of birds eat a lot of fruit, which we usually don't put in our feeders, and they'll eat insects in particular. Especially baby birds need insects to have the protein that they need to grow up and become adult birds. Especially caterpillars, they're juicy, they're full of protein for baby birds. And almost all, about 90% of land birds really need caterpillars and other insects to feed their young.
And that makes a lot of sense. So maybe the bird feeders are a little more supplemental to what the native plants can provide.
I think that's a good word, supplemental. It's nice to have, and it's fun to see them close by, but having a variety of native plants that provide for birds throughout the growing season is really the best.
So before people go out and start getting their hands dirty, what do you recommend as the first step in getting a garden ready for birds?
The first step would really be to prepare the soil that you're going to plant them in. Taking out all the plants that are there, having bare ground is really best. And of course, it's particularly important to get rid of invasive plants, which tend to take over and will really wipe out any planting that you do if you don't take them out.
And I do have a question about invasive plants, but before I get to that, you mentioned in the book that people should stick to planting true native plants rather than nativars. What's the difference between the both?
Well, a native plant is like, sometimes we say straight native plants. They're the way they evolve, they're natural. But horticulturists often like to take those native plants and add or detract things to make them, in their view, better. And sometimes it's not the worst idea. But what happens is that if they change one thing in the plant, for example, the color, they might lose the ability of the plant to produce seed. Or if they have too many petals, the extra petals were where the pollen and nectar was, and the plants lose that. So oftentimes, but not always, I have to admit, but oftentimes nativars lose their best value for plants. They have less nectar, maybe no nectar, no seeds. And there's so many plants, it's hard to study them all and make sure. So that's why it's just easier and more practical and better for birds to stick to straight native plants.
And you do cover, I believe, over 50 native plants that can attract birds in your book. But what are some of those invasive plants that you mentioned that people should keep an eye out for and remove when prepping their garden?
Well, there are three big ones, but there's lots of others too. But that would be buckthorn, honeysuckle. Those are both shrubs. And then an herbaceous plant called garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is an herbaceous plant and it can take over and wipe out the good and native plants that are in the understory. It can be quite aggressive. It's very easy to pull out, but it can be brought in by animals too, even after you take it out. But once you get it out, it does reduce in numbers quite a bit. And then buckthorn and honeysuckle are shrubs, and they do have berries, but the berries aren't of best value for birds. Buckthorn the berries will give the birds diarrhea, and the honeysuckle has berries. Since they're so invasive, that would be the only berry available for the birds, and they wouldn't get the variety of other berries that had different nutritional value for the birds. And it can also take over woodlands and reduce the growth of trees. Usually the best way is to cut them down and just put a little dash of herbicide on their trunks so they don't regrow.
Well, I'm glad we mentioned those so people can keep an eye out for them. And we're getting away from this, well, hopefully, we're getting away from this pretty unpredictable weather so far this year. But what are some beginner-friendly plants you recommend people start planning around this time of year, around spring?
Yes, I know we do have crazy weather, but there are some plants that are pretty hardy. Black-eyed Susans are so popular and lonely. They're pretty hardy. Purple coneflower is a good one. Wild bergamot. Those are some of the beautiful ones that I think would be pretty hardy in most cases. First of all, they would attract insects while they're growing, and then in addition, they'll have seeds galore for the birds that are seed eaters. So there's value throughout the year with the insects, the seeds, and so forth.
And when people are planning their garden, how important is it to have water access or offer water access to birds in their garden?
Water is great because in the Midwest here, we've lost about 50% of our wetlands that birds would have been able to access in the past. So having a bird bath or a little pond, birds just love them. And they, especially during droughty times, they love to take a drink of water or take a bath. The most important thing, of course, is to keep the water clean. And you can often do that just by having water circulating because you don't want to breed mosquitoes either. Mosquitoes breed in still water. But if you have circulating water with a little bubble machine or a little waterfall in a pond, that would keep the water moving and it would deter mosquitoes.
Oh, I like that tip. Well, one of the beauties of observing birds in the spring and summer is seeing them nest. I personally love seeing mourning doves nest. What are some native plants that encourage nesting?
The great majority of birds nest in trees, either in the branches or in cavities or in shrubs. And of course, a lot of people have small properties. Shrubs are great. I have seen many nests in, for example, the shrub called nine bark, and in dogwoods too. Birds love to nest in the dense foliage and branches of those shrubs. Some birds do nest in herbaceous species, in cattails and so forth, but the most birds do nest in trees and shrubs.
And does having dead vegetation around too help with the nesting?
Oh, yes, I always keep dead vegetation around because that gives the birds cover too. Don't clean up too much in the spring and don't clean up too soon either. It's best to wait till we have mostly 50-degree days and so forth before you cut down the vegetation because you're going to cut down and harm the insects too that birds need.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go ahead and reintroduce us. I'm Lake Effect's Garrett Nunez, speaking with Mariette Nowak, author of Birdscaping for Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region, about how to attract birds to your garden. So, Mariette, your book focuses on 5 groups of land birds: hummingbirds, prairie birds, savanna birds, shrubland birds, and woodland birds. Why did you decide to organize the book this way?
I like to organize it in the kind of the habitat birds need. Often a similar group of birds need similar habitat. And by having a whole group of birds, you can offer tips on how birds in that group might need the type of food that you're offering. For example, shrubland birds usually like a lot of fruit, and so you want shrubs that produce fruit, whereas hummingbirds like flowers that produce nectar. So you want to concentrate on those kinds of flowers. So it's good to offer the birds the habitat with which they have evolved and prefer.
That makes a lot of sense and easy to access when flipping through the book, depending on the type of garden that you have.
Exactly. Yes. And so a lot of people, if they have a little bigger yard, might have a spot for shrubs and shrubland birds, or they might have a lot of a little woodland for the woodland birds and so forth. So you can actually have quite a variety in your yard if it's large enough. Otherwise, you can concentrate on just one type of habitat.
Well, someone listening to our conversation might be a renter like myself. I'm not a homeowner. Someone might just have access to a porch or a balcony. Is it possible to create a small pocket of prairie for birds when you have no yard?
Oh, definitely. A lot of people do that. One good way to do it is to get some big 5-gallon jug, make sure there's drainage, put a few rocks, and then potting soil in, and then put in 3 to 5 plants. When you choose plants, either for a larger garden or for a porch prairie, try to have a plant or plants that will blossom throughout the year, like spring, summer, and fall. And for example, for sunny porch prairie, you could have kind of a silky aster, which is a small aster, a type of coreopsis that's smaller, and butterfly weed, and those would blossom and provide color and insects throughout the season. You could put in a few grasses too, such as prairie dropseed or little blue stem. Those are short grasses that would prop up those plants. But if you have a shady porch, you could use wild geranium and columbine and zigzag goldenrod, for example, which would be plants that would blossom and produce insects and seeds through the season. That's great because you'd have more of a continual native plant scene for birds. Some people would have yards to the porches and another yard and so forth. The best idea is to have a continuous native plant offering for the birds throughout neighborhoods.
I have personally never heard of a porch prairie or a pocket prairie before, so that's really interesting. And a theme that keeps coming up from our conversation that I've noticed is that why is it important to have a diverse number of plants?
First of all, if it's a droughty, dry year, some plants do better than in a very wet year. And we've had both, right? We've had some droughty years in the past and then flooding in other times. So it's really good to have that variety for that reason. But also, you have more variety for the birds, and it's better for them to have a variety of offerings and nutrition. So all kinds of good reasons to try to have variety. And they believe that if you have a better diversity, your native garden would be more stable and long lasting. And one kind of good thing about a porch prairie is that you can water them regularly if they need it. Whereas if you have a stand of prairie off rather far away, it's harder to keep them watered. And it's especially important to water them when you first plant them, months and year, to make sure they're well established and get their roots down.
I want to bring up that one of the most exciting parts of spring migration is seeing ruby-throated hummingbirds. I think of them as the jewels of Wisconsin. What are some native plants that will attract them to people's gardens?
Well, some rather easy ones to grow are wild columbine and then wild bergamot, and then actually a little shrub. Pussy willow is really good for the birds too. They have a lot of small insects for hummingbirds. Hummingbirds, while most of their food is nectar, they do depend on insects, just like most birds. So pussy willow would provide those insects, whereas the other two and a variety of other plants too would provide the nectar.
Well, we went over a lot of native plants that can bring birds to people's gardens. But what about when the birds start showing up? How can people protect them?
That is a very important topic. And some of the things that are hazards in our yard should be corrected. For example, window collisions are a big cause of bird deaths. What I have in my own yard are called Zen window curtains. Those are just lines of cord hanging about 6 inches apart or so on the windows. And that helps the birds see the windows because birds don't really see the windows. They'll see a reflection and think it's part of the woods or part of a prairie. So you have to make the windows visible. They do sell a lot of decals too. They don't always work as well, but it's a possibility. And if you go online, especially for the American Bird Association, they have all kinds of ideas on how you can protect your windows. Actually, more birds are killed by windows in lower homes like our own and small buildings than in those high rises. So it's important for all of us to protect our windows. A couple other really bad hazards are cats. We don't have pets now, but we had cats for many years as pets. And when we found that they were getting birds and small mammals, we kept them indoors, or sometimes we even put the cats on leashes. The reason for that is because cats, even well-fed cats, that's part of their instinct to kill. So it's really important to keep cats indoors. Better for cats too. They're not killed by accidents and they don't pick up diseases. So try to do whatever you can to keep cats happy indoors. And the final thing that's really a hazard for birds are pesticides. Most native gardeners do not use pesticides, or if they do at all, it's just in the beginning to kill a couple of invasives by minimal use of, say, dashing some pesticide on the top of an invasive shrub. But once you're done with that, you're done with the pesticides, because what you're really doing is poisoning or killing the very foods that birds need. And some pesticides are extremely harmful, especially the new ones called neonics for short, or neonicotinoids. And they found that even a small amount of those sometimes can kill a bird instantly. So we have to be extremely careful. So those are the three big hazards to birds: window collisions, cats, and pesticides. And I hope everybody does as much as possible to remove those hazards from your garden so birds can thrive.
Absolutely. And I think those are a really great summary. And we covered so much advice today. Mariette, we've reached the end of Chirp Chat. But before we wrap up, I always love to ask guests to shine a spotlight on a bird for the month. And I was wondering, what's a bird you'd like to highlight this month?
I would like to highlight the eastern bluebird. Bluebirds are so gorgeous, and they usually come kind of in mass as they're migrating at this time of year, about mid-March. We've already, I think most people might have seen robins already and some of the blackbirds, the red-winged blackbirds. But now's the time for the bluebirds. They have the sky on their back, that beautiful, stunning blue, and they have the earth on their breast because they're orange breast. So I think that's a great description of them. Sometimes they're called the bird of happiness.
The bird of happiness, is that what you said?
Yes.
Oh, I love that. I remember the very first time I saw an eastern bluebird, and I was in Missouri, and that's Missouri's state bird. I just smiled from ear to ear, and every time I get to see one, it's like a little treat. It makes my day, truly.
Good. Yes, I think everybody feels that way about bluebirds. And they don't come to real small yards, but they'll come to larger yards or parks and so forth, or the countryside. So I hope everybody gets a chance to see a lot of bluebirds this year.
I do too. Well, Mariette, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with me. I'm really excited to create my own pocket of paradise for birds.
Well, thank you. I was delighted to be here.
Mariette Nowak is the author of Birdscaping for Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region. She's also an ecologist and the former director of the Ware Nature Center. Nowak spoke with Lake Effect's Excret Nunez. To learn more birdscaping tips, head on over to WUWM.com.